to another video. In this particular video, I'm going to be doing an in-depth, you could say, creating the fundamental rules behind the spirit realm, essentially, which is what one might encounter during the DMT experience, such as an ayahuasca ceremony, or specifically an inducing such as smoking and NDMT, which is in itself a form of methamphetamines just from a natural base compound, whereas methamphetamines is based off of a synthetic of the same compound. Now, in terms of the actual realm one would experience in terms of the supposed awakening upon the spirit realm, what might be some of the rules within this said realm? Well, for one, you could say the same rules within this realm, which are the 10 Commandments. And in said rules is a perspective, which from this particular kingdom we were able to draw the 10 Commandments from, which means from that realm itself arises a universal law into the light, which this is a kingdom of light. Now, in terms of the overall awakening process, you would essentially awaken upon what would essentially feel like a spaceship made of light, of Taurus-like energy. It almost looks like a cartoon, the damn thing, for Christ's sake. But anyways, in terms of the drug addicted self, they might then themselves see how, okay, I now know what happens beyond death in their supposed understanding, which in their understanding, if this is what happens beyond death, they can essentially say, well, now I know that beyond this point, I can get there at any time. I just have to essentially just get there. And based on this particular perception, we then see a complex arise, a separation, you wish, from the rest of society, which in the complex of the drug addict, we then see in their mind, they essentially think, oh, well, I can get there at any time. So there's no technical moral compass behind any of my decisions. And then the individual may take on a strength known as an extremely narcissistic complex, which in the controlling of its environment will do everything it can to assure its survival as an individual, but not assure the survival of the rest. And you might say that according to its emotional or logical intelligence, whichever it leans more towards. Now, in terms of the overall rules, in terms of the hunter-prey aspect, that which the self-narcissist has taken upon the external world, which as a result has caused it now to be seen as an isolated self, an alienated self, which at the end, approaching the near end of its life in old age terms, you might see an old drug addict is so isolated that they become addicted once again to a new stimulus, which is simply the act of what you could say manipulation, which is a narcissistic trait. And the more this person ages, the more perceivable it begins to be noticed, which then at the exponential rate of potential at its peak at the current present day and age, you would then see a retraction where you then reanalyze the previous patterns of potential manipulation, allowing you to arrive with this one particular statement regarding the judgment of the individual, if this is where they believe they're going to go at the time of their death, which they believe they can get there as a drug addicted self anytime they essentially smoke, and boom, they get there. Which, if they were to die upon smoking, they would just essentially get there. But in the notion of a moral compass, you see there is the angel Michael, which is often left rather obviously in plain sight. Now, in terms of the judgment itself, let's analyze what the judgment might be to the drug addict itself that thinks they will get there no matter when they want and how they want, without a moral compass of how they've interacted with the external world within the previous realm. You see, if in the idea that entering heaven is not inherently just for those that are purely inherently good, but it is more of those that are purely inherently evolved. And the evolution of humans, we see they are a pack-like animal, which as a mammal, the human, just like wolf, survives in a society such as a pack. The more the number, the more you would have a better chance of surviving based on your ability to essentially interact with them. Which, if you have warm blood, you could say, based on the drug addict itself, that which in your analysis of yourself, you would say you have warm blood at that particular point, which is a notion derived from the notion of the amount of neurotransmitters that are flowing behind your system. It is a hypersaturated system, which in itself carries a more thermic reaction. You are more ready to explode at any particular point. And this is as a result of years of drug addiction. And in this particular years of drug addiction, you then see the patterns at which you then analyze behaviors at which you have manipulated the environment around you to benefit yourself and not those around you, because in the idea that the self is the moment you awaken to that dragon, you could say, which you continuously chase. And in that notion, you think you're somehow going to go to the kingdom of light, thinking at any time you can get there just based on the fact that you're just going to smoke your way there and get there. Well, in itself, I would say that's rather paradoxical, which in itself is a processing of your own mind, because as the addicted self to that particular point, you might see yourself having a moral compass problem, which at that particular point in believing you can enter heaven whenever you want to is in itself a derangement, which I've been questioning as this video is progressing, questioning your mental state as an individual, because in the idea that you can simply get to heaven whenever you particularly choose to, without fundamentally following the rules. Would you let yourself into heaven at that point? I wouldn't. I think you wouldn't either. And so we need to create a change where we can create essentially a resonance shift, an arc of sorts, where we can outweigh the previous 7 decades of your life, possibly as an older drug addict, if you feel like you're going into the terminal end of things. And the more you induce this, the more you essentially feel this complex build and build and build. And over 7 decades now, as an elder self, you might feel complete control over everything, but you don't realize the fundamental key behind it is in the inability to understand the overall moral compass of things, you see, in the fact that you were not able to integrate within society, or specifically take part within the pack, if the beings within this reality didn't accept you within this reality, based on the fact that you sought to manipulate the world in order to control the world around you in this drug addicted self, resulting in the complex which you believe you are essentially the dragon, the devil, which is this belief behind this drug addicted self, because this is where you draw your power from. And in the exchange of one polar opposite must be another polar opposite, a whiter light, which from your dark magic you yourself might be experiencing now a bit of a tremblance, because I'm actively pulling that darkness out of you. Call it an exorcism if you wish, a rebirth. In understanding that there is a fundamental value, which is the ability to get along with the beings of said reality. If you can't get along with the beings of said reality here, and you are willing to sacrifice these beings in this reality to get to the next, what makes you think that all of a sudden the beings in the next reality will all of a sudden see you as a threat or as a stepping stone, which in your moral ideology of thinking you are higher than the rest as a narcissist, in the controlling aspect of things, if I may dive into the spirit realm with you in this particular case, as the guiding force behind your experience, you would actively see that in order to belong, you must belong, which means essentially you need to be able to get along with the rest. And if in the act of fulfilling your self-indulgement, you specifically create a negative experience for the rest, such as anger or abuse, not just to random people, but to even the very seed that which you plant, I would argue in itself is a lack of a moral compass, because you simply seek to go to the essential spaceship at any particular time you want. But the problem is at the judgment itself. Because see, at the cost of the token, you might hold heaven in your hands, but the initial cost of the token is the physical flesh, which in itself has a metaphysical process. And this suicidal idealization you might have as this narcissistic, drug-addicted self of just sabotaging the world completely, until you essentially just say, I've had enough, and you just go, I would argue is essentially where the root of the problem is, because this is where we can essentially arise to the conclusion there is trauma. And in that trauma, you became a repeat offender of pushing your sins upon the rest of the world, so the rest of the world may experience it in hopes that you become light enough at that point to essentially go, which is the paradox of it all. It's not that by ridding myself of my sins onto others that I become light enough to make the ascension. It's by actually being light enough, by holding the world's sins upon myself, that I may make the ascension. And so in your reversal of your statement, you need to change the perspective now, because you have been living in the opposite way. And now I invite God, or the notion of God, a Christ-like figure within your life, where you must invite a goodness, where you can see you can actively transfer this. But if you're that deeply rooted in the drug-addicted self, well then I suggest you present yourself back to hell where you came from.